God, it feels like ages since I've covered Berserk. For those that don't know or haven't read the title because you're an agent of chaos and choose videos at random, this is a series where I review manga completely blind. Going into Berserk, I knew virtually nothing about this series, and now I find myself having long since passed the halfway mark, and within this video crossing into territory of an arc with a title I refuse to believe wasn't inspired by Star Wars in any way, shape or form. I mean, this can't be a coincidence. There have been a lot of deviations on this tale of self-discovery, self-sabotage, and seldom before seen horrors imposed on Guts throughout his sprawling journey to, I guess, deadify Griffith, who was his friend, sort of, who he bested in one-on-one battle, who went off to do terrible things to a princess, who got tortured for that, who almost died, who became an angel of darkness, and then reborn anew. All the while, Guts has... But thankfully, this complex story within this arc starts to quell the flow of questions being asked, and instead starts to answer some as we move towards what now feels like a tangible goal with a host of brand new character arcs that honestly had me enjoying it far more than the Conviction arc for reasons I will get into in this video. Is that a controversial take? I don't know, but what I do know is that I am totally not Mark, and this is my blind review of Berserk's Falcon of the Millennium Empire Arc, Part 1. One thing I can say about Berserk categorically is that it is dense as all hell when it comes to its plot, themes, and character writing, and not necessarily in that order either. For that reason, I wasn't able to cover everything I wanted to in the last episode where I covered the Conviction arc's ending, and so, thankfully, because this arc is much less complex, we have some extra time to quickly give my impressions on what happened with all that craziness. And while I really want to get into how this arc kicks off, like, seriously, what happened took me so off guard I nearly fell back into my chair, I want to talk about Mr. Eggman. I'm going to try to be honest here. I'm not sure I fully grasped what happened with regards to this weird guy following everyone and lurking in the shadows throughout a portion of that arc. With that said, something about his design, mixed with his uncharacteristic lack of involvement with the story, made me feel, I don't know, uneasy in ways this story hasn't managed to achieve thus far. And I've seen some stuff in this story. Upon closer inspection, the Conviction arc, generally speaking, is all about what people desire the most and the conviction that it takes for them to achieve those ends. Ironically, or fittingly, while the entire world is begging for salvation in the Conviction arc, the Eggman, who comes from the worst, most rotten places of society, someone who doesn't even really consider himself a person, is the one that works as a vessel for this, quote, salvation, granting an answer to those desires by bringing the Hawk of Light into the mortal world. Griffith is back and seems to be totally fine again in his mortal form, which is, oh my god, I don't even know if I can process that right now. The Eggman, as someone who watched over Albion and its people, first as a spectator and later as some sort of participant, transforming Mozgus and his torturers into semi-apostles, is easy to miss at first, but how this tiny thing became the center of the story, still without anybody noticing and achieving his own goals by literally changing the world forever, is poetic and sort of prophetic in a sense when you think about this arc's title. Furthermore, and we're getting there, the cursed child of Casca and Guts appeared many times during the story, seemingly to protect Casca, but in the end runs out of gas or dies. Either way, he is absorbed by the Eggman, so they both don't die alone. Which is so fittingly Berserk, I don't know why I didn't see that coming. Is this the end of this character? I'm not so sure. I don't think Miura would make the cursed child show up just to help out the main character and then vanish, but only time will tell, I guess. By the end of the Conviction arc itself, the predictions of Skull Knight are once again challenged by Guts, and once again, while everything happens according to what he says, one thing remains different. Guts and Casca are reunited, and it's thanks to all the people Guts knew and all the people that decided to follow him throughout this story. Interestingly, there are some similarities between events from the past that we can notice here too. We have another eclipse, Griffith is reborn into another divine being, Guts and Casca are saved, and even some parallels I mentioned before between Farnese and Casca also exist. And if we want to get really crazy, there could be some inversions at play here too. The The Hawks die during the Eclipse and Golden Age's climax, while Guts' new friends all survive in Conviction, and some of them even decide to follow his tracks. Perhaps this is an indication that Guts is slowly edging his way to an outcome that's imminently desirable rather than an outright horror show or a compromise like this Conviction climax was. But okay, to round out my analysis of the Conviction arc's conclusion, before I move on to something else, I think I should share my favorite part of this story, which was Guts' choosing of protection for Casca over vengeance towards Griffith. Having once been a man destroying himself on this endless violent crusade for revenge, thanks to the lessons he's learned in this story, chose the less indulgent and selfish option. Guts, the protector of Casca. And interestingly, the panel structure here seems to be an homage to one of Miura's favorite mangas, Devilman. Just a fun fact that I thought I'd include. With that said, Griffith's rebirth is astonishing. The circumstances surrounding the kingdom with the Kushan army in stride is pretty suspenseful. The people of Midland full of fear and hope is appropriate. And Guts and Casca fighting for their lives and Griffith flying over some of the most incredible landscapes I've ever seen in manga kicks off this next arc. Falcon of the Millennium Empire. As I noted towards the beginning of the last section, one of the arc's strong points is, I think, its ability to take complex emotional stakes and present them in a format that's honestly quite easy to follow on a surface level. This will help in my conciseness when writing this review. And so, instead of going through things one at a time in a boring fashion, considering that this arc thus far is split up into two plotlines, Guts and Griffith's respectively, I thought the best way to tackle this video is by exploring my impressions on each of these plotlines individually. That is, after what happens in the very first scene of this arc. When Guts arrived with Casca in tow to their small base of operations, and I saw that Griffith was waiting for them, I think I had what could only be described as a mild aneurysm. After having come to terms with choosing to protect Casca after giving up what was the perfect opportunity to take him out at the climax of the prior arc, seeing him here like this was one of the most stunning instances I've experienced in the story. There's been a running trend since the very beginning of this manga, with it framing a number of instances and moments highlighting that Griffith is out of reach of Guts. Sometimes metaphorically and sometimes quite literally. However, there have been instances where he's surprised even Griffith with his very existence, flying in the face of what should have happened to him by now. He should have died. Guts' sheer determination to struggle onward towards his goal is the savage heartbeat of this story. However, in this scene kicking things off, while Griffith appears to be the same person he knew back then, as he has been in the case of every prior tale, he is still unreachable. Zod, the Immortal, stands before Guts as the formidable obstacle he is with a new conviction. His sword, once lost in the boredom of thousands of battles, finds a new purpose: to protect his overlord, Griffith, against the giant dragon slayer of Guts. Once more, the two rivals clash. While watching this take place, it felt almost as if time was standing still. While the action is naturally as good as one might expect from Miura with some outstanding illustrations on display, it was Griffith's short conversation with Guts that really took the reins of this scene for me. This is the first time these two have been in communication with each other in such a long period of time, and for Griffith to effectively espouse the same rhetoric and vibe as when he was in the Golden Age arc is both nostalgic and haunting at the same time, with the context of what's happened since those simpler times. And it's in this short but illuminating conversation we notice something a little different about Guts. Instead of the man who had a clear conviction for revenge or protection, he seems to be stuck in a sort of limbo, unable to fully and completely dedicate himself to one goal. More on that in just a bit. There was one instance that I found quite surprising during this scene, and that was Griffith's sudden protection of Casca. There's the obvious contrast being made here with Guts in that Griffith seems to be single-minded in his goals, and therefore without hesitation can act, in this case protecting Casca. However, this conflicts quite violently, I think, with the heinous acts he's perpetrated in the past to both Guts and specifically Casca. He's perfectly willing to sacrifice any number of people if it means him reaching his goal of ruling over a kingdom. But this stands in direct contrast with that. I'm not sure what to make of it, but perhaps it's a mind game. The very last time Guts saw Griffith in this state and appearance, he had left Griffith outmatched and defeated, on his knees as he walked off in the snow. Snow in this series carries with it a tremendous amount of symbolism, I've noticed. It can be interpreted as the cleaning of the old slate and fresh start, and it can be emblematic of isolation and emptiness. When Guts defeated Griffith back during the Golden Age arc, he inadvertently shook the status quo in everyone's eyes, and Griffith knew that, which in addition to his caring for Guts was part of the reason why he reacted like he did. However, this scene's conclusion almost acts as Griffith's revenge for that moment as he leaves Guts alone in the snow after a crushing battle with his minion, Zod, with him holding all the cards and through Casca reminding him of what he did to her. But that's just my take. Following this scene, the two main characters, Guts and Griffith, fracture into two separate storylines. While they naturally reconnect at a later point, I will be diving into Guts' portion of the story first, as it's by far what I have the most to talk about, and by extension, what I found the most entertaining and interesting.
Right now, I, totally not Mark, the YouTube channel you so graciously decided to click on, has decided to bring you an ad for an energy drink you only vaguely recognize. In a video that has nothing to do with energy drinks, even tangentially. On a site that no one would ever think to search for energy drinks, ever! Inexplicably, they decided to sponsor me for not one, but an entire year's supply of monthly videos with full creative control. Morons! And to show my appreciation for frankly preposterous and unjustified vote of confidence, I've decided to push their patience to the absolute limit by making statements like G Fuel is directly responsible for global climate change, funding ISIS directly, and tastes like baboon water. Is any of this true? Should you buy G Fuel? What is baboon water? Why are you looking at me for answers? I'm an idiot. So what are you waiting for? Grab yourself a bottle of baboon water today and piss off.
Guts. Picking up the pieces following this climactic battle, a new goal or destination becomes apparent. Casca cannot take care of herself, and this safe haven they once knew has been destroyed because of Guts' battle with Zod. Perhaps, again, this could be symbolic that Guts can't have it both ways. He can protect Casca while also fighting Zod and, by proxy, Griffith. This speaks to the conflict in Guts' mind, which this arc deals with predominantly as he travels to Puck's home, the land of the elves. And this is where the character writing for Guts gets extremely interesting. On these travels, Guts realizes how difficult it is fighting the demons of the night that attack while also having to consider Casca's protection. Everything was easier when he didn't need to hold back, when he could indulge in that more animalistic side of himself, that side that he knew could struggle and survive. However, he can't do that now. He has to fight 10 times harder in order to stay alive and to protect Casca, and can't afford to be a savage sword seeking blood any longer. Now he instead has to learn to be a shield and a sword, the pressure of which ends up breaking him. A sentiment echoed through quotes like, "Sword feels heavier than ever," or "Casca is a shell of the person she once was. Is there any trace of the old Casca inside of her?" Or even, "He wanted to rescue her and now he did. Now what? He reached the goal, but how can he keep his promise to her and to himself of never abandoning her?" All of these quotes speak to the frustration, the conflict, and ultimately the mindset of Guts that wants to believe Casca is worth it. But just like in every difficult challenge, there's always that side that tries to rationalize a way out of that tough responsibility, particularly when the stakes are as high as they are for Guts. And this is where Miura decided to explore something really interesting within Guts' character. Since the beginning of the story, there's always been a more primal or beast-like persona that Guts would embody in order to successfully survive his day-to-day existence. What I once thought was an artistic choice depicting Guts as this beast of the darkness has become a very tangible and real plot element. Since Lost Children, we've been aware of the Beast in Black, and following a difficult series of frustrations surrounding Casca, struggling to protect her and even questioning whether or not he should any longer, she goes missing. After having promised himself that he would never lose her again, in the adrenaline, fear, and frustration, Guts snaps. The beast once again takes over, and in the process, hurts Casca, scars Casca, the person he loves the most. In a fashion eerily reminiscent of what Griffith committed, he became a monster. And if we ignore the obvious and awful imagery for a second, there's a phenomenal piece of storytelling taking place here through this character that calls all the way back to the very beginning of his life. And that character being called back to is Gambino. When we were first introduced to Gambino way back at the very beginning of the Golden Age arc, we were presented with this rough around the edges, tough soldier type that was good at what he was. A soldier, a fighter, a killer. If he wasn't good at being that, then he would have likely died long before he could even have been any sort of father figure, good or bad, to Guts when he was younger. However, once he lost his ability to fight, he started to more obviously and overtly lash out in terrible ways, which ultimately led to his downfall. He couldn't be a good father, a good nurturer, or a good carer, perhaps in part because all of his life he had to do the opposite to survive, to look out only for himself. This obviously isn't to excuse anything he did in the story, but it speaks to perhaps his mindset and psychology when in those moments. This facet of his being perhaps so useful in keeping him alive that it became who he was, and when he was stripped of his ability to utilize that strength, he broke. Similarly, Guts has lived a life as of late where he's been forced to fight for his life against odds he's been told are insurmountable, with death waiting around every single corner. In order to survive this, Miura has shown us how animalistic and beast-like he becomes once fighting off hordes of monsters and demons. Defying what he was told was impossible. It served him as a useful function, and as such has pushed him in a direction of being someone that wants to be alone and wants to be someone that relishes in crushing the weak and taking what he can for himself. Which brings us to this moment where he makes the decision to not indulge in those heinous acts any longer and instead do what's difficult. He decided to care. To care for, and above all else, protect Casca. And along the way, he quickly discovers how difficult it is to do that. How difficult it is to remain compassionate and human in those dire circumstances. And how easy it might be during those more difficult moments to allow oneself to be lost to those darker impulses. In other words, in real time we are seeing what it might have been like for someone not as strong as Guts to go through something like this in Gambino. What it might have been like for a prisoner of war who can't let the battle go. And following this, Guts feels horrific. And rightfully so. The very same trauma Guts experienced and in many ways still is experiencing after what Gambino did to him was what he passed on to Casca, what he scarred Casca with. The fear of being touched, or more specifically in this instance, the fear of Guts himself. How can they keep going? Well, Miura gave us an answer almost immediately. Guts needs help. Farnese and Serpico. Since their introduction to this story halfway through the conviction arc after Lost Children, the dynamic of Serpico and Lady Farnese has been an enjoyable one, and perhaps that's putting it a little too lightly. Serpico from the outset is very easy to respect and cheer for. Even when he decided to take on the main character Guts on the side of a cliff during the conviction arc, I still found myself cheering his innovative and opportunistic efforts in taking down Guts to help his Lady Farnese. However, with her on the other hand, having been introduced as a religious extremist with strong swaths of sadism right beneath her unassuming and innocent facade, Lady Farnese has been a character I never thought I would get the chance to actually explore in greater detail, let alone appreciate. Berserk is in one way or another quite interested in demonstrating how awful people can be while also possessing the courage to explore the reasons as to why that might be the case. Farnese is shown to be a hateful, entitled, scornful bigot that relishes in the literal burning of innocent people. And yet through the flashbacks we receive either through Serpico and herself, we discover that her upbringing was far from normal or secure in some senses through the eyes of Serpico himself. Serpico's journey and history is as you might expect. He's a determined, attentive, and appreciative individual with unwavering loyalty to those he feels a connection with. Having come from the slums and from a mother that struggled to cling to reality, it was Farnese's request to take him in that ultimately plucked him from a life of scrounging to a life by her side, where Serpico ended up witnessing some of the unsavory aspects of her character and many of her struggles firsthand. And this is where there might be a parallel to point out with regards Lady Farnese and Casca. Casca and Farnese are sort of a package deal in this arc, you see. All the while Guts does what Guts does best, hack and slash, Farnese guards Casca with her life, something she never would have done when we first encountered her. In other words, she seems to be on a path to redemption. It's made clear early in this arc that Farnese carries with her an admiration and curiosity for Guts and what he's managed to show her. Since meeting him, her entire worldview has not only been challenged but successfully shattered. Compare this to Casca's experience with Griffith, who changed her worldview and following that held her devotion. Casca was lost in a fantasy, an idealistic cocoon-like vision of what Griffith really was. Farnese, on the other hand, by following Guts, has managed to actually better herself. She's gotten stronger both mentally and physically, and in addition to that, Serpico has even remarked that she's becoming more compassionate. She's starting to feel more human. In other words, Guts was a positive influence on her life, while Griffith was a negative one on Casca's. And fittingly, Farnese becomes Casca's security blanket in this section. Isidro. There isn't a lot to discuss here, at least not in comparison to Guts, Casca, Farnese, or even Serpico, but I am thoroughly enjoying what Isidro contributes to the story in more than one way. On a surface level, there's something to appreciate with his growing rapport alongside Puck. Their comedy helps to alleviate the dire or intense scenes a little bit, and by doing so helps to enhance those more serious moments by creating a wonderful contrast in tone. A similar technique has been used not only in comics, but also live-action films for decades. For reference, think about how effective Robin Williams was at shifting from humor to more dramatic tones in the blink of an eye. They often go hand in hand. I mentioned before that I appreciated the commonalities that existed between Isidro and a more traditional shonen protagonist also, which shine through magnificently within this portion of the story. While he is by no means the focus, the minor subplot or character arc he's undergoing in this arc is quite cathartic. He wants to be the best at what he's trying to do, and when he doesn't measure up to the other talents of other warriors in the party like Guts or Serpico, you can visibly see the disappointment in himself descend across his face. And while this aspect of him is explored in more detail, with Guts encouraging him to use his strengths and to follow what feels right to him, the real struggles in his development are made with the introduction of a brand new character and addition to the party, the little witch, Shiruke. Shiruke and the Astral World.